Hello and welcome to Runkle of the Bailey. My name is Ian Runkle. I'm a Canadian criminal defense and firearms lawyer. Today I want to talk about the Alec Baldwin shooting. So if you're not familiar with what happened here, Alec Baldwin was handling a firearm on a movie set. It discharged, that injured the director and killed the cinematographer. So a tragic set of circumstances. I'm going to be talking about firearm safety practices and in particular firearm safety practices on movie studios and how those differ from the firearm safety practices that you might follow at home or at the range. Movies need to do different things with their guns than you'd be doing at the range. And so the standard safety rules in terms of what you do at the range are both too strict and not strict enough in different ways. There's different requirements. So I'm going to be discussing that and the steps that are taken in order to make movie filming with firearms safe and how things seem to have gone wrong here. I'm also going to be talking about Canadian law, so I'll be discussing what charges I might see flowing from this if this were to happen here in Canada. One thing I'm not going to be doing in a whole lot of detail is going on about Alec Baldwin's previous comments. Yes, he has said some obnoxious things online, and a lot of people don't like him. But I don't think that's terribly relevant to the discussion here, except that I will take this opportunity to remind people that if you're ever in a situation where there is some tragedy, either an accident or that you're forced to use a weapon to defend yourself, your comments that you make on social media may be analyzed by the public, by the police, by prosecutors, and potentially by a jury. So if you're in the habit of saying things that that you might regret later, now is a good time to get out of that habit. I'm sure that some of the comments that Mr. Baldwin has made in the past are things that now he wishes he'd never said. So the next thing I want to do is talk about the reports. What has been reported, and so what things I will be assuming are true for the purposes of talking about this. I don't know personally what went down. I wasn't there. The investigation isn't fully complete. But there's a lot of things that have been reported, and so I'll sort of be relying on those in terms of making my assessments here. The first thing is that apparently this has been a movie set that's been plagued with problems, including safety complaints. And one of the things that's been reported is that there were two situations previously where a gun that was supposed to be cold, so nothing in it that could fire, no blanks, nothing, went bang when the trigger was pulled. Twice prior was the reports. So that's a very concerning thing and very relevant, I think, to further analysis. The next thing is that apparently Baldwin was handed a firearm and was told that it was a cold gun. Now, people have been unclear on what cold gun means, so I'll just try to make this very clear. A cold gun should be one that has nothing in it that goes bang. No live ammunition in the conventional sense of something that discharges a projectile, nor any blanks. So it should be a firearm where if you pull the trigger, all you're going to hear is click. That's very important. And we are told that Baldwin was at this point, they weren't filming a scene, but that he was practicing drawing. So he was drawing the firearm, practicing a cross draw, and it's not entirely clear how this went off. This is a Western period firearm, and from the sounds of it, probably a handgun, a revolver. Now, some of the firearms from that era had problems where, for instance, an exposed hammer could get caught and it could fire. They have less safety features than modern firearms. So it's not clear if Baldwin pulled the trigger or if perhaps it snagged on his costume and ended up firing in that direction or in that fashion. So we don't entirely know how it fired, but it does appear that he was practicing sort of firearm handling as opposed to in the course of filming. So this is not a situation where, for instance, some people have theorized that he might be pointing the gun at the camera for a particular stage shot. It doesn't appear from the current reports that that's the case. And this is also relevant in terms of our analysis and our assessment here. It also seems, and this is a bit of an inference on my part, that this was live conventional projectile firing ammunition. And I say that because although blanks are dangerous, blanks are not sort of a perfectly safe thing. When you fire a blank, there is a projectile. It's just a bit of wax or paper or something else that is less harmful, and it's coming out at less speed, but that's required in order to make the blank function properly. That can injure or kill somebody at short ranges. So people have been injured or killed by playing around with blanks. One thing that's happened on occasion is people put a gun to their head, it's loaded with blanks, and they think that's going to be harmless. And both the hot gases that are projected and the little projectile end up killing them or injuring them quite badly. So this is a, one thing to consider, but I don't think that this was a blank. The reason why is that the reports that we're seeing at the moment say that there was one shot fired and that it penetrated through the director and then into the cinematographer. I don't think that the paper or plastic or wax wad from a blank would be likely to overpenetrate in that fashion. It appears that this was a situation where a live cartridge somehow found its way onto the set. I should note here, in terms of set safety, live cartridges should never be on a firearm using set, with one exception that does not apply here. That exception is if you're filming something, for instance, a documentary where you're looking at ballistics. If you're looking at firing a real gun into ballistic gelatin or something, then you might need, in that very specific circumstance, to have live cartridges on set. But that doesn't apply here. And if that is happening, they take very, very, very special precautions to make sure. One of the critical safety procedures for filming is that live cartridges are nowhere on set and never make it into the gun. So that is a critical, this is one of those facts that in and of itself, if it turns out to be true, essentially tells us that something went catastrophically wrong in terms of the safety procedures. Some of the reports we've been hearing as well, and I can't confirm them at this stage because this is all reports, but are that people were playing around with these things during off hours, taking them out to the range and shooting live projectiles through them. This should not ever happen. Everyone I've talked to says that this is a major safety failure, that this is something that should not ever take place. And it is a potential mechanism for those live cartridges to have ended up in a firearm. So the next thing we hear is that, during the course of this practicing drawing, there was a discharge. Again, we don't know if that was the trigger was pulled because, practicing draw fire, or if it was a situation where, there was some sort of snag or the like. Clearly, in the course of this, that practice of draw fire ended up muzzling the director and the cinematographer. I don't know if that was carelessness or intentionality, if he was intentionally pointing it at the director because he thinks it's a safe gun. I can't speak to that, but I will discuss the alternatives. What happens if it's one way? What happens if it's the other? All of these things are things that we'll hear later, more details. So that's kind of my assumptions here in terms of what I'm talking about. This is the factual matrix in which we can discuss things. So let's move on now and talk a little bit about firearm safety as it applies to movie sets. I've talked a little bit about it. I'm going to re-emphasize it as we go. The first thing we really need to talk about is who's responsible for safety, because there's a number of people who bear some responsibility to varying degrees. The first of these is the armorer, also potentially a stunt coordinator. The assistant director may also be responsible in terms of safety issues, as well as the actor themselves. Now, perhaps surprisingly, the actor themselves, the person who's handling the firearm, may bear the least amount of responsibility, and that's partially because they're expected to not necessarily know what they're doing. Lots of actors do not have experience with firearms, and Mr. Baldwin has made several comments about sort of being anti-gun. I would expect that he's not proficient with or used to firearms. But there's supposed to be people watching over him to make sure that he doesn't screw up. You're basically supposed to be assuming that the actor might be a screw-up in some fashion. The person who bears the top level of responsibility and the ultimate responsibility is the armorer themselves. They're the person who should be keeping custody of the firearms, making sure nobody is messing with them, making sure that no live projectiles are anywhere on stage, nothing that can fire a projectile, so it's just blanks if blanks are being used. They're required essentially to be the person who says no. There may be situations where, for instance, the director says, hey, can we hurry this up a bit? because, you know, we've got a limited filming schedule. And the armorer might have to be the person who says, no, listen, if you want to do this, we're doing this right. Otherwise, me and the guns are going for a walk. We're leaving. So ultimately, the armorer may be put in a difficult position of having to say no to some people who might be big names. You know, a famous actor might say, hey, can I try this gun out? This is really neat. And they might have to say, no, you can't, because this is a, you know, a film set. This gun is working today. It's not a play gun. This is a working gun. So there's a lot of measures that are taken, and those measures in terms of safety protocols will depend on exactly what's going on. When blanks are being used, they'll set up plexiglass and wood barriers so that, you know, for instance, if you're pointing a gun at, you know, say the cameraman, you might have a plexiglass barrier to ensure that even if a projectile discharges, it shouldn't impact the camera person. So this is very carefully done, and the armorer, again, is responsible for making sure that the gun only contains at any given time the projectiles or the cartridges that you expect it to. As I mentioned previously, these might include blanks, either full power, half power, quarter power, you know, some sort of reduced power blanks, or one of the things that is often used is just dummy cartridges. And dummy cartridges are used because a blank doesn't look like a real cartridge. A blank has a crimped together end. And so there's some circumstances where you need that dummy to look like a real projectile, particularly, for example, with revolvers. Revolvers have a cylinder that's open at the end, so the audience from some angles will be able to see those cartridges that are waiting to be fired. So they can't look like they have a crimped end. What they use for those is dummies, and these are dummies that have a sort of primer, but it's a dead primer. It won't go off if you fire it, and they don't contain any powder. There's no live primer or live primer. It won't even make a pop. It'll just make a click. Now, one thing that's done for these is to actually differentiate them, to make it easy to differentiate them from live, you know, cartridge firing projectiles, is they'll actually put beads of some, like little metal pellets in them. And so what that means is that you can shake it, and then you can hear that, you know, this is not a real cartridge. The reason why this is very important to understand in this situation, I've seen reports that the assistant director who handed the firearm to Mr. Baldwin. Now, this is a breach of protocol. Normally, it should be the armorer handing the firearm to the talent, to Mr. Baldwin. So it's not clear why this happened. There are some circumstances where the assistant director might do this, but it's ultimately the responsibility of the armorer. It also appears that the assistant director didn't check the firearm or didn't check it carefully enough. I've seen some reports, and I haven't been able to confirm them, but I've seen some reports that say that the assistant director shook the firearm and determined in that fashion that it was unloaded. What this might mean is this might mean that this was a situation of the assistant director thinking that there were dummy cartridges in there being at least one dummy cartridge in there to rattle, but also a live cartridge being present. This is pretty much the worst case scenario for safety procedures, because somebody shaking that gun to say, hey, are these live cartridges or are these dummies, because they otherwise look identical, is going to think that they're dummies. And if they're not being super careful and pulling each cartridge, shaking it and listening to it and then putting it back, they could easily come to a dangerous assumption. That might be what happened here, but again, this is some conjecture. So again, you know, live cartridges, one of the very important safety rules is that live cartridges are not to be on set. There should not be any circumstance where this is the case. From reports, the armorer may not have been present at the time of filming, which is also a very strange circumstance. Where is the armorer? Why aren't they doing this? A lot of the procedures and protocols that would normally be taken for setting up a shot wouldn't be in place here, because this is a situation where Mr. Baldwin was practicing with the firearm. He's not going and, you know, this isn't a setup shot where they've got safety barriers and so forth. This is a situation where he's, you know, he's trying to make sure he's got his draw right. in terms of, proper procedure there, you'd think that they'd want to make sure that he's doing this with an entirely unloaded firearm. No blanks, no dummies, nothing. So that is itself a bit of a safety violation. What we see here is that there's all sorts of procedures and protocols that should be in place, that, it should be confirmed that these firearms never have live ammunition near them, that the armor is is keeping them under their care at all times, that these are not used for target practice or anything like that during filming. And lots of these things appear that it's possible that they were deviated from. So what would proper procedure have looked like here? First, you'd have the armorer keeping control over the firearms at all times. And they might have to step away briefly, for instance, if they're going to the bathroom. But in that case, they designate somebody and say, watch these guns, make sure no one touches them. Nobody should be touching the guns except the armorer and the talent. And it should be that the armorer is checking the guns. The armorer is the one responsible. That doesn't appear to be the case here. It looks like the assistant director is the one who passed the gun to the talent here. And it's not even clear if the armorer was involved, if the armorer knew that was going to happen, or if this was a spur of the moment decision. That is, if that is what happened, that in and of itself is a grievous safety failure, because you have a one person who's responsible for things, the ultimate responsibility. And if you start getting other people thinking that they can do things, then you may end up with corners inadvertently being cut. And in fact, not having the armor there at all times is itself cutting a safety corner in a big way. The next one, as I've reiterated several times, no live cartridge firing projectiles on set, and no using the firearms for target practice offset while filming. No live real, cartridge firing projectile should be getting anywhere near this gun while it's being used, for filming. It is as I said before, a working gun. It's not for playtime. It's not anything. The sheer presence of a cartridge firing projectile on the set is itself a massive safety failure that it's pretty much impossible to justify. There is no good explanation for that. In and of itself, that is a problem. Before handing the firearm to the actor, it should be checked, and not simply checked, in a cursory fashion. I'm just going to cut here. This is a picture that's courtesy of Movie Armaments Group, as I mentioned before, and it's them showing the actor as they're handing them the firearm, with a flashlight, showing them inside the gun so that you can see, and the actor can see, that it is a cold gun. It doesn't seem that that was the case here. It appears that the assistant director yelled "cold gun" as he hands it off to the actor, but that there wasn't that checking step. Missing or skipping that step is itself a bad safety failure. And the actor, it appears, from the reports here, that this wasn't a filming setup. And so if you're not filming and you need to, for some reason, use the firearm or, do training or whatever, and I don't know if the armorer had approved this or was okay with this or what, or if this was being done, sort of casually as kind of, in the worst case scenario, horsing around would be the worst case. But there is no justifiable circumstance where a gun being practiced with ends up pointing at another person. So that is a further safety failure. And that one would rest both with Mr. Baldwin himself, as well as with whoever's supposed to be supervising him and managing the firearms. So ultimately the armorer, but also the assistant director here. So what we see here is that this is a tragic accident, but it results from not one, but many consecutive safety failures. And this indicates, and again, I'm relying on reports here, so assuming that these reports are correct, but this shows us in part why there have been so few firearm accidents on film sets. They're decades apart. So while they do get the news, that doesn't mean that using firearms on sets is dangerous or that we need to upend our practices on this. What it says is that we need to follow practices. And there have been some reports here that there were labor disputes where people were saying, listen, this is unsafe. You're not treating us well. And part of that is that you're not following safe practice. So we're going to hear in terms of there's going to be civil lawsuits. There's going to be a lot of information on what was happening here coming into the public eye. We're going to hear exactly what corners might have been cut. And this is concerning. So fundamentally, this is not a case about, firearms on set are dangerous. It's a story about firearms on set are dangerous if you are willing to play fast and loose with safety protocols and procedures. It's important to note here that some people have been saying, hey, listen, here's the rules that you'd follow at the range. But a movie set isn't like a range. You would never, for instance, have somebody intentionally point a firearm at another person at the range. But that might happen on a movie set. That might happen, where somebody is pointing the camera or pointing the gun into the camera and there's a camera person behind it, or sometimes even pointing a gun at themselves, where they might have modified the gun to have a completely blocked barrel and to be firing the lowest power blanks available just so that they can show that shot. So there are situations on movie sets where things are done that would otherwise be dangerous at a range, but there are different safety protocols set up to handle that, and it is absolutely essential that they be followed and followed rigorously. It may be a situation where there's a good-natured armorer who loses control of the set, but the armorer they have to have the force of will to say, listen, this can't happen. We have to shut this down. So that's ultimately where some of the responsibility is going to lie. So I guess let's move on here and talk a bit about potential criminal liability. And again, this will be if this was here in Canada, who could potentially be charged and with what? I want to start by taking a couple of charges off the table, and that's first-degree murder and second-degree murder. Both of those require specific intent to kill here in Canada, and there's simply no indication that that was the case. There's plenty of indication that there may be negligence or carelessness. Ultimately, that'll be something that the courts are going to sort out, because I can guarantee you there's going to be a civil suit on this if there aren't also criminal charges. But there's just nothing to suggest that there was any intentionality here. So murder off the table. Manslaughter, on the other hand, might be a possibility here in Canada, because we're talking about something where there might have been a death resulting from the commission of some other offense. Now, what other offenses might be in play to trigger that manslaughter charge? Well, careless use of firearm is one. Careless storage of a firearm is another possibility, and also pointing a firearm. So the first person who might be concerned here is the armorer. The armorer has a duty in terms of their storage of the firearm, their use of the firearm, to make sure that they're following, proper procedures. And proper procedures will be, based on the reasonable standards. And in this case, it'll be an elevated standard of somebody in the role of armorer. Because when you take on that additional responsibility, it's not just like you're an ordinary gun user. This is a situation where you have an elevated responsibility, and that can trigger an elevated standard of care. So does the armorer potentially face liability here? Well, quite possibly. If it's the case that the armorer allowed live cartridges, like projectile firing cartridges on set, that is a potential grounds for carelessness. If it's the case that the armorer used these firearms or allowed them to be used for target practice and failed to properly clear them, that's another place where we might find careless use of a firearm. Careless storage of a firearm. Was the assistant director who's said to have retrieved this firearm, was he supposed to have access to that? Was that something that was supposed to happen? Or did that result from some sort of negligence or poor supervision on the part of the armorer? Because if that's the case, and if that then results in the death, then you may have a situation where manslaughter is a potential charge. And that would be a really bad circumstance here, because ultimately that's where you start seeing some really big jail time potentials. Again, this is if it were in Canada. I'm not going to be able to contemplate or, sort of consider the US law, because I'm not a US lawyer. You don't need more ignorant takes on this. There's lots of ignorance about this one out there. So I'm just talking about what I know, which is if this were here in Canada. What about the assistant director? Well, again, this is a situation where it might be careless use. When he says cold firearm, is, that it's a cold gun. Did he check that, or did he just assume that it was a cold gun because it's on that counter? The assistant director is one of the people who is responsible for safety. If he doesn't know that this is a cold gun, or if he hasn't taken proper precautions, then this may be a situation where he himself is at risk of, for careless use. And originally I was going to say that I don't think it would be likely that Mr. Baldwin could face any charges here. And that was because initial reports had suggested that maybe this was in the course of filming. And so if it was in the course of filming, then Mr. Baldwin would be relying entirely on other people's directions. In a situation where they say, here's where you point the gun, it is safe to do so, it is safe to pull the trigger at this stage, those kinds of things. And it's not usually the actor's responsibility to check the firearm, although properly speaking, they should be checking it. They should be insisting that the armorer shows them that it's a safe gun before they take on that responsibility. And, right now, as it stands, the talent, the actors aren't really expected to have any firearm proficiency. But I think that's something that maybe should change. Maybe it should be that if you want to be an actor who handles firearms on set and who does this sort of thing, that you have to take some courses and get some proficiency, especially in firearm safety, that you are also part of the safety procedure. But, let's consider the question of what was Baldwin doing with this gun? Because if he's relying on, instructions, hey, this is a cold gun, that still doesn't necessarily give him the ability or the sort of permission, legally speaking, to point this at anybody. Pointing a firearm becomes a big problem here, because if it's not in filming, if it's just for practice, then you're not allowed to point a firearm here in Canada at anyone without a lawful excuse. Filming in a situation where it's very carefully controlled could be a lawful excuse. But simply practicing it where you don't need to do that, I think that that's a much more difficult sell for that being a lawful excuse. I think that's a place where he could potentially face charges for the pointing a firearm. And once that is potentially on the table, then it might open the door to, again, the big prize, the manslaughter charge. So that's one concern. The other thing is that Mr. Baldwin was apparently a producer. Now, there's been some debate as to whether he might be a producer in the sense of actually having control, or whether this is sort of a nominal producership just so that he can get proper, just as part of sort of the Byzantine ways that Hollywood pays people. So, but regardless, we've heard that there were 2 accidental discharges here, or not accidental, negligent discharges would be the proper sort of terminology here. Because they were situations where it was supposed to be a cold gun and was not. That also raises the question of what should these people have done knowing that? Should there have been a shutdown here? And I'm going to say, yeah, there should have, in order to reassess things. I mean, if you have one, negligent discharge on a set, I'd think that everybody would want to say, let's stop, let's do a big takedown and figure out what went wrong. This is a big problem. That's at 1. At 2, I'd be expecting them to shut things down and start firing people, because, once is okay, maybe somebody screwed up. 2 is there is a pattern here and somebody might die. And in fact, ultimately somebody did. So that's, also raises questions. What should he have considered given those situations? Frankly, we're still waiting to see what comes out. I don't know what charges will or will not be laid here. But here in Canada, there would definitely, I think, be a path to lay charges against at least one person for up to manslaughter. This is an ugly situation, but the next question that we sort of get to is what should be done? And really, there's people apparently in the US saying we need to ban using real firearms on sets. And I don't think that's called for here. The safety record is not that. And the issue here isn't the real firearm used on the set. It's carelessness. It's not following safety procedures. That's what appears to be the situation here. It appears that various rules that are essential for ensuring that firearms are safely used on set were not properly followed. And that's my concern here. And when we have this tragedy, there's this rush to do something. Everyone wants to be seen to be the solution. And sometimes the solution is not what it looks like. You know, this might not be a situation to ban firearms from being used on sets, but perhaps to look at, you know, labor rules, look at, you know, whether there was proper supervision here. Certainly one response here that I think is entirely appropriate is that there's going to be lawsuits and there's going to be a lot of, you know, sorting things out in terms of, you know, there's going to be a lot of money is going to end up changing hands, I suspect, over this one. There's going to be people getting sued and it's going to be ugly. But I don't know that this really requires the steps that people are suggesting. Really, this seems to me to be a call for reputable armorers. And, you know, because there's lots of armorers who have lengthy, you know, lots of experience and no safety issues. This really illustrates, you know, how important that is to have a skilled and trained and, you know, proficient armorer on set. And, you know, being in control. So I guess those are sort of my thoughts here. I've probably left some stuff out. This is a bit of a complicated and convoluted video. I don't want it to get too long. But let me know what you think. Let me know if you think I've missed anything or if you think I'm out to lunch. I really wanted to sort of share some of the comments here and some of the details as to what's going on here, because I was seeing things like, you know, prop gun being used or cold versus live and what that means. And I think a lot of the commentary out there was not really considering the issue and not really spending the time to try to understand it. I hope I've made this clearer. I hope I've added to the discussion. I'm sure that if I haven't, I'm going to get some emails from some of the people I spoke to going, hey, Runkle, what the hell? And if I do, if I screwed this up, I will do a follow-up video going, hey, here's what I screwed up. Let's try to fix it. So, but I just wanted to kind of share this with you. It's an event that's getting a lot of news coverage, and I think that we're looking in some of the wrong places here in terms of what's going on. Anyway, thank you for watching. I wanted to thank my Patreon supporters at the $50 level: Jonathan Wheeler, Jason Elliott, Canada's National Firearms Association, Slightly Left of Center, Good-Natured Hypothetical Firearms Association, Mike, Kyle Martin, Jean-Guy Toussaint, CCFR, and the Canadian Shooting Sports Association. At the $30 level, Sights and Arms Limited and Marc-Olivier Damour. And at the $20 level, Raymond L. McKinnon, Matt Ward, Mark Whittington, Jane Baben Luxor, Dale Nesbitt, Cameron Johnson, Bruno R., and Drew Elsich, and Aaron Del Salt. Again, thank you as well to Movie Armaments Group, who provided a lot of information to me that helped me better understand what was going on, because I'm a firearms law guy, but I'm not necessarily a firearms movie guy. That said, you know, I wanted to sort of share things with you because I think that it's important that we have a better understanding of these kinds of things that are making the news. Check their stuff out. I'm going to link both their Instagram and their webpage there. They've done some neat stuff. And thank you for watching. I hope this has armed you with knowledge. See you next time.